I don't understand. This ticket is confirmed. You can't just deny me boarding.
Sir, as I explained, this flight is overbooked. We can offer you compensation and rebook you for tomorrow.
This is my boarding pass. I don't understand why I can't board.
I apologize, Mr. Davis, but the flight is full.
All right. I appreciate your help.
The sharp hum of the airport terminal was suddenly broken by a stern voice. "I'm sorry, sir. You can't board this flight." Marcus's hand froze mid-motion, his boarding pass still clutched in his fingers. His eyes darted up from the paper to meet the flight attendant's cold gaze. Her uniform was neat, crisp. Everything about her posture screamed authority. I don't understand," Marcus stammered, trying to hide the confusion threatening to overtake him. His mind raced, the distant murmur of other passengers fading as the harsh reality of the moment sunk in. He had made it through security, had checked in, had even received his boarding pass. There was no reason for this. "It's a mistake," he said, his voice growing quieter. The attendant's smile was tight. "No mistake. You're not on the list. You'll need to step aside." The waiting passengers whispered, glancing at him. He could feel the heat of their stares like an invisible pressure, all of it making the air feel thick and suffocating. The flight attendant's fingers hovered over her tablet, then glanced at him with an air of finality. "Sir, I need you to leave the gate area now." Marcus's pulse quickened, his stomach turning. He could feel the sting of shame creeping into his chest, rising, threatening to choke him. But then, just as he opened his mouth to protest, a voice echoed from behind him. "Is there a problem here?" A man in a dark suit approached, his footsteps firm, but his expression unreadable. The flight attendant turned toward him. "Yes, sir. We have a passenger here who is refusing to leave." The man's gaze fell on Marcus, his eyes momentarily flicking to the attendant, before he spoke with a slow, deliberate calm. "You're telling me, a paying customer, that he can't board this flight?" The word struck like thunder in the silence that followed. The flight attendant stammered. "Sir, I'm just following procedure." The man nodded, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "Then let me remind you of who owns this airline." Marcus froze. It was a single sentence, but it shattered everything. The world around him felt distant, as if the walls of the terminal had suddenly closed in. The realization was slow, but it hit hard. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew this face. He knew the name behind it. The man smiled, the corners of his mouth curling slightly. "I believe you have something you need to explain, don't you?" Marcus Davis's heart raced as he shuffled through the crowded terminal, heading toward the gate. It was a routine business trip to New York City. Nothing special, just another week in the life of a successful entrepreneur. He had just wrapped up a meeting with potential investors in Los Angeles and was eager to get back to his office. As he approached the gate for Flight 237, he glanced at his phone to check his emails one last time before the flight. But the noise of the bustling airport seemed to melt away the moment the flight attendant stepped forward and blocked his path. Her crisply pressed uniform looked almost out of place in the chaos of the terminal. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice steady but cold. "You can't board this flight." Marcus blinked, his grip tightening around his boarding pass. He checked it online, printed his ticket, and passed through security without a single hiccup. His mind churned, trying to piece together what had just happened. I don't understand," he stammered, glancing around, hoping this was some kind of mistake. "I'm on the list. I've been confirmed. Look, here's my boarding pass." He held it out, the paper trembling in his hands. The attendant didn't take it. She simply glanced down at her tablet, her fingers tapping against the screen as if the answer was clear. "I'm afraid your name is not on the list, sir. You'll need to step aside." A wave of disbelief washed over Marcus. "This doesn't make sense. I've got my ticket right here. I've already checked in. There must be some mistake." The woman's expression didn't change. "It's no mistake, sir. Please step aside." His pulse quickened. The hum of the terminal, the chatter of the other passengers, faded into the background as he tried to process what was happening. His thoughts scrambled, his mind unable to grasp the reality of being denied boarding, especially when there was no clear reason. "Can't you check again?" "There must be a mistake," Marcus said, his voice gaining a tinge of frustration. He looked around, but no one else seemed to be paying attention. The air felt thick, heavy, suffocating with the weight of his growing anxiety. The attendant's cold stare bored into him, unaffected by his plea. "You'll have to leave the gate area," she said, her voice clipped. Marcus clenched his jaw. The embarrassment began to settle in. His eyes scanned the terminal, now feeling the full force of the eyes on him. Strangers whispering, glancing his way, the discomfort palpable. The knot in his stomach tightened. His hand dropped to his side, and for a moment, it felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. There was a quiet, sharp sting of humiliation, but beneath it, an icy certainty began to build. There was something more to this, something he couldn't put his finger on, but he felt it, a sense of being singled out. He could feel the sting of injustice rising with each second that ticked by, and then from behind him, he heard a voice. It was low, calm, and commanding, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus turned to see a man in a tailored suit moving to the crowd toward them with purpose. His gait was confident, almost authoritative, and there was an air of quiet power about him. He stopped a few feet from the attendant, his eyes glancing briefly at Marcus before settling on the woman. The flight attendant stiffened, taking a small step back, and for the first time, her eyes shifted uneasily. "Yes, sir. We have a passenger who is refusing to leave the gate area," she explained, her voice much less sure now. Marcus was still in shock, barely able to process the scene in front of him. He had been humiliated, dismissed, and now this stranger, this powerful stranger, had stepped in. But why? The man's eyes turned back to Marcus, locking with his. There was a brief moment where they seemed to measure each other, silent, but heavy with unspoken words. Then the man spoke again, his tone colder this time, sharper. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice almost too calm. "You're telling me that this passenger, who is clearly holding a valid boarding pass, is being denied entry onto my plane?" The flight attendant's lips pressed together in a tight line, and she glanced nervously at her tablet. "Sir, I'm just following the protocol. There's a discrepancy. His name isn't on the list. I can't let him board." The man's jaw tightened. His gaze shifted from the attendant to Marcus, then back again. Without breaking eye contact, he spoke with a deliberate calmness that made the tension in the air even more suffocating. "Protocol," he repeated. "Is that what you're calling it?" There was a silence that hung heavy, thick with anticipation. Marcus stood frozen, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him. "Let me remind you," the man continued, his voice cold but authoritative, "of who owns this airline." Marcus's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widening with a sudden shock. His thoughts scrambled, trying to put the pieces together. This wasn't just some random businessman. This was a man in front of him, the one who owned the very airline that had just humiliated him. The man's gaze flicked back to Marcus. There was no anger there, just a strange calmness. And then a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, almost imperceptible. "I think it's time we had a conversation," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Marcus. The attendant, flustered and unsure, stepped aside, leaving Marcus and the man in the middle of the terminal. The other passengers had gone quiet, their eyes darting between the two men. Marcus's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the man, struggling to understand the weight of the revelation. He had no idea who this man was at first, but now the reality hit him with full force. This was no simple incident. Something much deeper, much darker was at play here. The man stepped closer, his presence imposing. "I believe," he said, the words slow and deliberate, "you have some questions, and I think you'll want answers." The weight of the situation settled on Marcus, a realization creeping over him. He wasn't just dealing with a random case of discrimination. This was something far more personal, something he hadn't anticipated, and it was only the beginning. Marcus's mind raced as the man's words hung in the air. He was barely aware of the attendant stepping back, retreating into the background, her presence now reduced to a shadow. He was focused entirely on the man in front of him. The sudden realization struck him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just an ordinary businessman. This was a businessman. The one whose name he had seen so many times in the headlines. The one whose face was plastered on billboards. The man who owned the very airline that had just humiliated him. Marcus's mouth went dry. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat more erratic than the last. The realization was hard to accept, impossible, even. How had it taken him so long to figure it out? The man in front of him, his tailored suit exuding wealth and power, was none other than Jack Richards, the billionaire entrepreneur who had built his empire from the ground up. Richards owned several companies, but this airline was his crown jewel. The air around Marcus suddenly felt thicker, as if the walls of the terminal were closing in. Jack Richards didn't appear to notice the shift in Marcus's demeanor, or perhaps he didn't care. His gaze remained steady, unwavering, as if he were simply waiting for something, waiting for Marcus to catch up, waiting for him to say something. Marcus swallowed hard. You own this airline? His voice came out more like a question than a statement, as if he were still trying to wrap his head around the truth. Richards's lips curled into a smile, one that was both cold and knowing. I do, and I think you'll find that the situation is rather unfortunate. His voice was smooth like silk, but with an undercurrent of something darker. But it's something I can fix, if you're willing to let me explain. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. His mind was still reeling from the shock of it all, his eyes flicking between Richards and the now silent attendants who stood watching, unsure of what to do next. The entire terminal had become eerily still, the buzz of normal airport noise completely absent. All that remained was the thick tension between Marcus and Richards. Richards continued, sensing the hesitation. What happened here, Marcus, wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a glitch in the system. It was something far more deliberate. Marcus's chest tightened. He had heard the whispers, the stories about systemic racism in corporate environments, the subtle but powerful ways certain people were kept out, held back. But hearing it from Jack Richards's mouth, hearing him acknowledge it in such a casual way, was something entirely different. I've been racially profiled, Marcus said, the words escaping his lips before he could stop them. The weight of the statement surprised even him. But it was true. He had known it all along, and now, standing here with Richards, it felt almost like confirmation, like he was standing in front of the very system that had kept people like him at bay. Richards's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced once again by that cold, controlled smile. Racial profiling, yes, he said, his voice clipped. But let me assure you this isn't personal. It's business. Marcus's brow furrowed, his confusion deepening. Business? How is this business? Jack leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. You see, Marcus, it's not just about who gets on the plane and who doesn't. It's about who matters, who we choose to acknowledge, who we choose to elevate. This airline, this company, has been built on a certain type of customer, on a certain type of image. And you, Marcus, well, you're not exactly the type of image we cultivated. Marcus's jaw clenched, his body tense as he fought to keep his composure. The words stung more than he cared to admit, a deep, aching insult sinking into the core of him. He had worked his entire life to be successful, to prove that he was more than just the color of his skin. And here was this man, this billionaire, essentially telling him that none of that mattered. I don't care about your image, Marcus said through gritted teeth, his voice low and dangerous. What I care about is being treated with respect. Richards raised an eyebrow, as if impressed by Marcus's response. Respect? That's a tricky thing to ask for in a world where respect is given only to those who fit a particular mold. The world doesn't care about respect, Marcus. It cares about power, about who can make things happen. Marcus stood there, stunned by the starkness of Richards's words. There was a harsh reality in what Richards was saying, a reality Marcus had been unwilling to accept until now. But what struck him the most was the casualness with which Richards spoke, as if everything he was saying was normal, as if everything was just business. Let me make one thing clear, Marcus said, his voice growing steadier with each word. This isn't just about me getting on a plane. This is about something much bigger, about the way people like me are treated every single day. You may be used to your little games, Jack, but I'm not. For a moment, Jack's smile slipped again, and there was a brief flash of something darker in his eyes. It wasn't anger, but something colder, more calculated. Something that made Marcus feel like the man was toying with him. "Maybe you're right," Jack said, his tone suddenly sharp. "Maybe you're not like the rest. Maybe you're more complicated than I gave you credit for. But you're also stubborn, Marcus. And that stubbornness, it could cost you more than you think." The words hung in the air between them like an unspoken threat. But Marcus wasn't intimidated. In fact, something in him snapped, something deeper than just a need to defend himself. It was a recognition that this moment, this conversation, was about more than just a single instance of racial profiling. It was about everything he had fought against in his life, the system that had always tried to hold him back. "I'll make sure people know about this," Marcus said, his voice cold and resolute. "I'll make sure the world sees who you really are and what your company represents." Jack's gaze flicked to the flight attendant, then back to Marcus, his smirk returning, but this time it was laced with something much darker, something more dangerous. "You think that'll make a difference?" Jack asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Do you really think the world cares about you, Marcus?" Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes burning with fury. "I'll make them care." And with that, Jack Richards' smile faded completely, replaced by a cool, calculated expression. "You just started a game, Marcus," Jack said, stepping back slightly. "And I always win." For the first time, Marcus felt a chill run through him. This was no longer just about an airline or a flight. This was personal. The tension between Marcus and Jack hung in the air like a thick fog, neither man willing to back down. The hum of the terminal had returned, but for Marcus, it was drowned out by the ringing in his ears. His mind was still reeling from the revelation of who Jack Richards truly was, who he represented. Jack had been polite, even charming, but there was something more insidious beneath the surface. He was used to controlling the narrative, used to being the one with all the power. And Marcus, for the first time in a long time, felt like he was standing in the shadow of someone who was truly dangerous. Jack seemed unfazed by the tension. He gave Marcus one last cold look, as if weighing something in his mind, then turned to walk toward a gate desk, his footsteps measured, unhurried. The flight attendant followed, her expression no less stiff than before, though there was something uncertain in her eyes now, a flicker of doubt, perhaps. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, watching them, his thoughts swirling. He wanted to lash out, to scream, but the anger inside him was starting to feel too big, too volatile to contain. He needed a plan. He needed to understand what had just happened, what was happening. "Mr. Davis?" A voice broke through his thoughts, and Marcus turned sharply to see a woman, in a suit standing a few feet away. She was a manager of the gate, her name tag reading Clara. She was eyeing him cautiously, but her posture wasn't as stiff as the flight attendant's. There was something more sympathetic in her expression. I don't know what just happened," Marcus began, his voice shaking slightly. He fought to steady himself. "Can you explain to me why I was denied boarding?" Clara glanced over at Jack's retreating figure, then leaned in a bit closer. She lowered her voice, though it was still loud enough for Marcus to hear. "I'm not supposed to say anything, but you've just encountered one of the more unfortunate aspects of this airline's history." She looked around again, ensuring no one else was listening. "There's a culture here, not just with Jack, but with some of the people he surrounded himself with. There's a pattern of profiling." But she hesitated. "But I've never seen anything like what just happened." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "So you know this happens often?" Clara nodded, her gaze downcast. "I don't have proof of it, but I've seen enough. The airline's customer base is," she paused, as if struggling to find words. "Well, let's just say they cater to a very specific group." "I'm that specific group?" Marcus asked bitterly, his voice sharp. He could feel the anger bubbling up again, and it was harder this time to contain. Clara's face softened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she glanced at her phone, her eyes flicking between the screen and Marcus, a frown forming on her face. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking again. "Look, I can't change what's been done, but if you want my advice, I consider finding a way to escalate this. The company has its problems, but it's also a machine that doesn't like to be exposed. If you push back hard enough, Someone will listen. Someone has to. The last words hit Marcus like a blow to the chest, and for a moment, he was speechless. He had always been aware of the systemic issues surrounding race, knew in his heart that things weren't always fair, but hearing it so plainly, so bluntly, from someone on the inside felt like a gut punch. Clara wasn't looking for a confrontation. She wasn't the one Marcus needed to confront. That was Jack Richards. But this moment, this brief, fleeting exchange with Clara, was a small crack in the larger facade. It gave him a sliver of hope, the tiniest indication that the truth had a way of breaking through, no matter how tightly the system tried to suppress it. "I'll find a way," Marcus said finally, his voice steady again. He wasn't sure how, but he was sure of one thing. He wasn't going to let this go. The next day, Marcus found himself sitting at his desk in his downtown office, the light of the morning sun filtering through the large windows. His fingers rested on the keyboard, but his mind was far from the numbers and strategies he was usually consumed by. Instead, his thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in the airport, to the way Jack had casually dismissed him, to the coldness in his eyes when he said, "This is business." It was no longer just about him being humiliated. It was about something much deeper, much more insidious. And Marcus knew that if he wanted justice, he would need to fight harder than he ever had before. His assistant, Brianna, knocked lightly on his office door before stepping in. She was holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. "You okay?" she asked, her tone soft but concerned. Marcus gave her a tight smile. "Yeah, just processing a lot." She set the coffee down on his desk and slid the folder toward him. "I ran some background checks on the airline. Thought you might find it useful." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You really didn't have to do that." Brianna shrugged, her lips curling slightly. "It's part of my job to look out for you. Besides, you've got a reputation for not letting things slide." He opened the folder, scanning through the documents. It didn't take long for him to realize what Brianna had found. The records were damning. Multiple lawsuits, complaints from passengers, internal memos that hinted at practices of racial discrimination. But what stood out to him the most were the names on complaints. People who had been treated unfairly, unjustly, and who had been shut down by the airline time and time again. People who had been told, over and over, that their voices didn't matter. His fingers clenched around the paper. Jack Richards' name appeared throughout the documents, but never explicitly connected to the complaints. His influence was clear, though. He had the power, the money, and the resources to keep things quiet. Marcus didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice on the other end answered. "Marcus, what can I do for you?" It was his lawyer, David Johnson, someone who had helped with various business dealings in the past. But this was different. This was personal. "I need you to file a lawsuit," Marcus said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I'm going after Jack Richards and this airline. It's time people knew the truth." David's silence on the other end of the line lasted just a beat too long, but Marcus wasn't worried. He knew David well enough to know that the hesitation wasn't about doubt. It was about the magnitude of what he was asking. And Marcus was prepared for it. "I'll get the paperwork started," David said finally. "But be prepared, Marcus. This isn't going to be easy. It's not just the airline we'll be going up against. It's a whole system of power and money." Marcus didn't flinch. He had been ready for this battle since the moment Jack Richards had denied him boarding. "This is bigger than just me, David," Marcus said, his voice steady. "It's time we made them care." The next day, Marcus stood in front of the courthouse, the weight of what was to come pressing heavily on his shoulders. The battle ahead would be difficult, the road long, but for the first time, Marcus felt like he was fighting for something real. Fighting not just for his dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had ever been marginalized, dismissed, and overlooked. The fight was just beginning. The rhythmic tapping of Marcus's pen against his desk echoed through the quiet of his office. It was early morning, and the city outside was still waking up, but Marcus's mind was 1,000 miles away. His thoughts kept returning to that moment in the airport, to the cold rejection, the sterile hum of the airline system, and Jack Richards' smug smile. The injustice of it gnawed at him like an invisible wound. But as he sat in his office, staring out at the growing cityscape, his mind drifted back to another time, A time when he was much younger, a time when he didn't have the privilege of wealth or status, when the world seemed even more hostile, more indifferent. He remembered the streets of his childhood neighborhood, run down, overcrowded, and filled with the kind of noise that never stopped. He could still hear the echoes of his mother's voice, calling him in from playing with the other kids in the summer heat. The blocks were filled with kids from his school, kids who looked like him, who lived in the same struggle. But it was also a neighborhood that lived with a quiet undercurrent of resentment, of judgment, of people who'd been pushed to the margins by a society that barely noticed they were there. He could see it so clearly now. The way people stared when he walked into a store with his mother, how some would look at his family like they didn't belong, how their eyes would linger just a second too long. He remembered the shame of being asked to leave a store, or being treated like he was invisible, or worse, like he was a threat. He remembered being followed around in the grocery store by an employee who was sure he was going to steal something, even though Marcus hadn't done anything wrong. And there were the school years, the endless fight to be seen, to prove that he wasn't just a statistic, that he wasn't just another kid from a poor neighborhood. Teachers had passed over him for opportunities, ignored his potential, placed him in lower-level classes simply because of where he came from, simply because of the color of his skin. But Marcus had been relentless. He fought for every chance, every opportunity that came his way, pushing against the weight of the world that seemed intent on keeping him down. His grades, despite all odds, were among the best in his class. His drive, his ambition, were impossible to ignore. When his peers partied, he studied. When they rested, he worked. And it paid off. By the time he graduated, Marcus had earned a scholarship to one of the best universities in the country. It was a hard-fought victory, one that had cost him his sleep, his peace, and more than a few friendships. But it was his, and no one could take it away from him. As he sat in his office now, reflecting on that time, Marcus could still feel the fire that had fueled him. The fire that had kept him going even when the world seemed intent on telling him that his worth was defined by his circumstances, by his skin. He had overcome it, but even now, the scars of those years still haunted him. The rejection, the unfairness, the sting of being made to feel like an outsider, it was all still there, just beneath the surface. His success hadn't erased those memories. It had only sharpened them. And now, as he prepared to take on Jack Richards and his airline, he realized that those memories, that anger, that need for justice, were going to fuel him once again. He wasn't fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been made to feel small, invisible, or worthless. Marcus's reflection was interrupted by a knock at his door. Brianna stepped in, holding a thick folder in her hands. Her expression was businesslike, but there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes, something like concern mixed with determination. She placed the folder on his desk. "Here's what you need," she said, sliding the folder toward him. "I've got everything we need to move forward with the lawsuit. The evidence you've gathered, along with the public documents I was able to dig up. There's enough here to make a serious case. But we're going to need to push harder, Marcus. Jack Richards isn't going to roll over. He's not going to let this go without a fight." Marcus opened the folder, scanning through the contents. He could see the outlines of the case forming, proof of discrimination, evidence of systemic racial bias, and internal communications from the airline that hinted at the kind of behavior that had led to his mistreatment. But there was more in the folder than just legal documents. There were news articles, interviews with passengers who had experienced similar treatment, and testimonies from former employees of the airline. It was all starting to come together. He looked up at Brianna. This is everything we need?" "Almost," she said. "We just need the right leverage. If we can find a way to get Jack's personal involvement, something that ties him directly to the culture of discrimination at the airline, it'll be a game changer." Marcus nodded, his mind already racing ahead. This wasn't just about exposing one instance of racial profiling. This was about bringing down the entire system. And Jack Richards was the heart of that system. "We'll find it," Marcus said, his voice determined. "We'll expose everything. And we'll make sure everyone knows who he really is." As Brianna left the office, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his thoughts still racing. He thought about the people who had suffered in silence, the passengers who had been treated like he had been, denied their dignity, ignored, pushed aside, The fight ahead would be long, and it would be painful, but Marcus knew that it was a fight worth having. For every person who had ever been made to feel small because of their race, for every injustice that had been swept under the rug, this was his moment to make a stand. This wasn't just about getting on a flight. It was about something much bigger, something that had been happening for far too long, and Marcus was going to make sure it ended now. That night, after Brianna had left and the office was quiet, Marcus stayed behind, poring over the case documents. His phone buzzed on the desk, a notification from an article about Jack Richards' latest business ventures. Marcus clicked on the link absent-mindedly, skimming through the details. But something in the article caught his eye. There was mention of an upcoming company event, a high-profile gala, one that would be attended by major investors, celebrities, and influential figures in the business world. The article described it as an opportunity for Richards to announce new initiatives for the airline, possibly including partnerships with major corporations. An idea sparked in Marcus's mind. The gala could be the perfect opportunity to turn the tables on Jack Richards. If he could get to the event, get the right kind of publicity, he could confront Richards in front of all the people who had helped build his empire. And maybe, just maybe, he could expose the true face of the airline for the world to see. Marcus smiled to himself. This wasn't just about the courtroom anymore. It was time to take the fight to the people who had kept Richards in power. The battle was about to get much more public. And Marcus was ready. The night of the gala arrived, and the city was alive with energy, its lights dancing across the skyline like glittering stars. Marcus had spent the entire day preparing, going over every detail, making sure that everything was in place. This was more than just an event for him. It was his chance to make his move. He wasn't just going to confront Jack Richards. He was going to make sure the world saw what was really happening behind the polished facade of the airline. The venue was a grand, luxurious ballroom in one of the city's tallest buildings, the kind of place where only the elite were welcomed. The guest list was a who's who of business moguls, influencers, politicians, and celebrities, all gathered under the glistening chandeliers to celebrate the success of Richards' airline. It was an evening designed to reinforce the power and prestige of the man who had built his empire on the backs of people like Marcus, people who had been ignored, marginalized, and used. Marcus arrived early, dressed in a sleek black suit that fit him perfectly, his demeanor calm but determined. As he stepped out of the car, he could feel the weight of what he was about to do pressing on his shoulders. This was the kind of event where Jack Richards thrived, where he surrounded himself with those who admired and elevated him. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen tonight. He made his way through the grand lobby, his eyes scanning the crowd. Everywhere he looked, he saw people laughing, shaking hands, exchanging business cards. The air was thick with opulence, the clinking of glasses and the soft hum of quiet conversation blending together into a low, constant murmur. But Marcus's focus was clear. His target was Jack Richards. It didn't take long for him to spot the man. Jack was standing by the bar, holding court with a group of investors, his charm and charisma apparent to anyone who passed by. He was dressed in a custom-tailored suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his smile radiated confidence. To the untrained eye, he was the embodiment of success. Everything Marcus had worked for, everything he was striving to be. But Marcus saw through it. He saw the mask, the layers of power and privilege that protected him. Marcus made his way toward the bar, his steps deliberate and steady. He knew that this would be his moment to confront Jack, to make his voice heard in front of everyone who had enabled the system of abuse. As he got closer, Jack's voice rose above the others, his laughter echoing through the room. And that's why we're going to expand into Europe next year. We're not just going to compete with big names in the airline industry. We're going to own it, Jack was saying, his tone slick with ambition. The group of investors laughed politely, but Marcus could hear the underlying truth in Jack's words. He wasn't just talking about expanding his company. He was talking about expanding his influence, his control. And Marcus was going to take that away from him, piece by piece. As Marcus approached, he took a deep breath, steeling himself. This wasn't just about an airline. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed men like Jack Richards to build their empires at the expense of others. Mr. Richards, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. Jack turned, his expression briefly surprised before settling into a mask of controlled politeness. "Ah, Marcus Davis," he said, his smile widening. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight. A pleasure." His words were smooth, but there was a sharp edge to his tone, an edge that Marcus didn't miss. "You've been hard to find lately," Marcus replied, his voice cool. "It's been difficult getting answers from you." Jack's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I'm sure you understand, Marcus. Running an airline isn't easy, but I'm always happy to make time for my loyal customers." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Loyal customers? Is that what you call us? Because what you've really been doing is exploiting us. You've been exploiting people like me, denying us our worth, and using your power to keep the rest of us in our place." His words were loud enough for a few nearby people to hear, but he didn't care. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been overlooked by people like Jack Richards. Jack's expression shifted, his charming facade slipping for the briefest of moments. He looked around at the people who had gathered around them, clearly sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The laughter had stopped, and now all eyes were on them. "You're out of line, Marcus," Jack said, his voice low but laced with a dangerous edge. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is business, and you're acting like it's personal. This whole thing, it's just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Marcus's voice grew louder, the anger that had been simmering in his chest bubbling to the surface. "There's nothing misunderstood about it. Your airline discriminates against people who look like me, and you've known it for years." He let the words hang in the air, letting them settle like a heavy weight. The room was silent now, the tension palpable. Jack's eyes flicked to the guests who had gathered around them, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're making a scene, Marcus. Do you really think this is the way to handle things? In front of my guests? You're embarrassing yourself." Marcus didn't flinch. "I don't care about your guests, Jack. What I care about is the truth. I care about making sure people like me don't have to live in fear of being treated like second-class citizens. I care about making sure that this stops." Jack's face hardened, and for a moment, the mask slipped completely. The charming billionaire persona was gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous. "You think you can take me down? You think you can change anything?" he spat, his voice rising. "I built this empire, Marcus. You think your little lawsuit is going to change that? You think you can bring me down with a few accusations? You don't know who you're messing with." The anger in Jack's voice was unmistakable, but Marcus wasn't intimidated. He stood tall, unshaken. "I'm not trying to bring you down, Jack. I'm trying to make sure people like me can stand up and be treated with dignity. I'm fighting for what's right." Jack's nostrils flared, but before he could say anything else, one of his investors, an older man with graying hair, stepped forward, trying to defuse the tension. "Jack, maybe we should move this conversation somewhere more private," the man suggested, his voice strained. "This isn't the time or place for this kind of disagreement." Jack glanced at the man, then back at Marcus. For a brief moment, the room held its collective breath, waiting for Jack's reaction. Then, with a tight-lipped smile, Jack turned on his heel, signaling for his guests to follow him. "I'll handle this later," he said through clenched teeth. "Enjoy the rest of the evening, Marcus." But Marcus wasn't done. Not by a long shot. As Jack began to walk away, Marcus called out to him one last time. "This isn't over, Jack. It's just beginning. I'll make sure the world knows what you really are, and I won't stop until justice is served." Jack paused for a moment, his back still turned. Then, with a voice full of venom, he muttered, "You have no idea what you're up against." The guests who had been watching the confrontation began to murmur among themselves, their eyes shifting between Marcus and Jack. And for the first time, Marcus felt like the power in the room wasn't in Jack's hands anymore. It was in his. He had taken the first step toward dismantling the system. He had made his move. Now, there was no turning back. The following days felt like a whirlwind, and the confrontation to Gala only amplified the pressure. Marcus hadn't expected Jack Richards to back down easily, but the night had left a mark. It had been the first time in years that Marcus felt the weight of systemic injustice so directly, so sharply. Jack's words had cut deep, but what bothered Marcus most was not just the arrogance of the man, but the feeling that Jack, despite everything, seemed untouchable. He couldn't shake the image of Jack walking away, his shoulders straight, his cold smirk lingering. That was the face of someone who knew how to win. And Marcus had just stepped into a battle that was far bigger than a single airline. It wasn't just about proving his worth anymore. It was about tearing down a system of power that had been built on generations of inequality. Brianna had been relentless in her support, working around the clock to compile more information on Richards and his company. Together, they had uncovered a series of internal memos and financial reports that painted a disturbing picture of the culture within the airline. It was far worse than Marcus had initially realized. The company's bias wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. It was a systematic approach to excluding certain groups of people, enforcing policies that kept minorities from rising the ranks, and creating a corporate culture that rewarded conformity over diversity. The more Marcus dug, the more it became clear that Jack Richards was the architect of it all. Richards wasn't just a businessman. He was a puppet master, pulling strings behind the scenes, ensuring that the airline remained a fortress of privilege. He was the one who had crafted the company's public image, projecting an image of inclusivity while behind closed doors. He perpetuated a culture of exclusion. The deeper Marcus dug, the more betrayal began to gnaw at him. He had built his success on principles of hard work and integrity, believing that the business world would reward those who fought for fairness. But here, in this world of money and power, he saw how easily those ideals could be twisted, discarded, and trampled on by those who didn't care about justice, only the bottom line. One evening, as Marcus sat in his office reviewing more documents, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw David Johnson's name flashing. His lawyer had been handling the lawsuit, but recently, David had been unusually quiet, probably because the pressure from Richards and his team was mounting. Marcus answered the call. "David," Marcus said, his voice tight. "How's it going?" There was a long pause before David spoke, and when he did, his voice was strained. "Marcus, we need to talk. I've been looking over the case, and I've had some troubling developments. You need to be prepared for something you might not expect." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" David hesitated again before responding. "The thing is, Richards isn't just playing the game. He's changing the rules. He's using his influence to discredit you. And it's not just coming from his company. He's got people in high places, politicians, corporate leaders, even people in the legal system. They're all in his pocket." Marcus felt the floor drop out from under him. "What are you saying, David? Are you telling me this is rigged?" "I'm telling you that Richards has a network that goes far beyond the airline. He's worked hard to build a system where his power is untouchable. And now, he's making sure your case never sees the light of day." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his thoughts spiraling. He had known the odds were stacked against him, but hearing it so plainly felt like a punch to the gut. Jack Richards had built an empire on exploitation, and now he was going to use that same power to crush Marcus's fight for justice. "So what now?" Marcus asked, trying to steady his breath. "What do we do?" "I don't know," David said quietly, "but you need to be prepared. We might have to make some hard choices if we want to move forward with this. I can't promise it'll be easy, and I'm not sure the system is on your side anymore." The weight of those words hung in the air, thick with the implication that this fight wasn't just about fighting an airline. It was about fighting the very system that upheld people like Jack Richards. Marcus felt a wave of frustration rise up, but he pushed it down. He wasn't going to back down. He had come too far, and he knew that the fight for justice wasn't won easily. He'd been fighting this system his whole life, and he wasn't about to stop now. "I didn't come this far to back down now," Marcus said, his voice low and resolute. "I'm not done. I'll keep pushing." David didn't respond immediately, and Marcus could hear the weight of his silence. "I'll do what I can, but Marcus, you have to understand, you're going up against something bigger than the law." Marcus stood from his desk, staring out the window at the city below. He wasn't sure if he could win. He wasn't sure if anyone could, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stop fighting. The world needed to see what Jack Richards truly was. It wasn't just about personal revenge. It was about exposing the deep-rooted corruption that had allowed men like him to thrive unchecked for so long. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't rely on the legal system alone. He needed to take the fight to the public. He called Brianna into his office and explained what he had planned. "I'm going to the press," he said. "I'll give an interview. I'll speak out about what's been happening. I'm not going to let this be swept under the rug. Jack Richards and his airline need be exposed for what they are." Brianna looked at him, concern in her eyes. "Are you sure this is the best approach? It's going to escalate things and it could get ugly." "I don't care," Marcus said, his voice firm. "The truth has to come out. If they're going to play dirty, I'm going to make sure everyone knows who's behind it. I'm done letting people like Jack Richards hide behind their power. This ends now." The interview was scheduled for that afternoon. Marcus knew that once he went public with the story, there would be no going back, but it was a risk he was willing to take. The truth needed to be heard. As the interview aired live later that day, Marcus's words reverberated through the media. He spoke about the systemic racism that had been allowed to thrive at the airline, about the culture of discrimination that had been embedded into its very structure, and about how Jack Richards had profited from the exploitation of people like him. He didn't hold back. His voice was calm but unwavering, and the raw honesty of his words made an impact. When the interview ended, the fallout was immediate. Social media erupted with support and condemnation alike. Hashtags started trending. People began to share their own stories of mistreatment by the airline. Marcus had done it. He had shaken the foundations of Jack Richards' empire. But as the media coverage grew, so did the pressure. Jack Richards wasn't going to let this slide. Marcus knew it, and he knew that what came next would be the true test of how far he was willing to go to fight for justice. The fight had only just begun. The press interview had sent ripples through the business world, but for Marcus, the immediate aftermath was nothing short of overwhelming. The media was ablaze with headlines. Airline CEO accused of systemic racism. Discrimination scandal rocks airline empire. People were talking, sharing stories, and some were even calling for a boycott of Jack Richards' airline. Yet, while the public outcry was growing, Marcus knew that the real battle was just beginning. The backlash from Richards and his company came quickly. Lawyers representing the airline reached out to Marcus's legal team, offering settlements and trying to quiet the storm with the promise of money and a public apology. But Marcus wasn't interested in apologies or settlements anymore. This wasn't about money. It was about something much larger. The airline's legal team sent a flurry of threatening letters, trying to intimidate Marcus into dropping his case. They accused him of spreading lies, of distorting the truth for personal gain, and even attempted to use the media backlash against him, suggesting that he had tainted his case by going public before going through proper legal channels. Marcus had expected this. In fact, he had anticipated that Richards would use every legal trick in the book to shut him down. But what Marcus hadn't expected was the depth of the media pressure. The legal threats were one thing, but the smear campaigns in the press were another. Every time Marcus opened his phone, another article popped up. Is Marcus Davis a real victim, or just another attention-seeking celebrity? Davis' accusations lacking evidence. Industry experts weigh in. The coverage was intense, and it wasn't favorable. Despite the mounting pressure, Marcus stood firm. His lawyer, David, advised him to stay quiet, to not let the media stir him into an emotional response. But Marcus couldn't sit back anymore. He couldn't allow Jack Richards' public relations machine to turn the narrative against him. He had to take control of the story, to make sure the truth remained at the forefront of the conversation. Marcus called a press conference of his own. With his legal team at his side, he stood before a room full of reporters, cameras flashing as he took his seat behind the podium. His heart was heavy with the weight of the situation, but his resolve was unwavering. "I didn't come here today to talk about money," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I came here to make sure the world knows the truth. What Jack Richards and his airline represent is more than just a business. It's a reflection of a system that prioritizes power over people. It's a system that doesn't care about those who are suffering from discrimination, as long as the profits keep rolling in." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle in. The reporters scribbled notes furiously, the room silent except for the sound of cameras clicking. "I'm here to tell you," Marcus continued, "that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have been discriminated against by this company. People who had been silenced, ignored, and dismissed, and they deserved to be heard. As Marcus spoke, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. This wasn't just about his fight anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been marginalized, pushed aside, or overlooked. The fight was bigger than he could have ever imagined. As the press conference ended, Marcus felt the weight of what he had just done. The media storm was in full swing now, and while some public opinion remained in Richards' favor, more and more people were beginning to question the airline's practices. For the first time, it felt like the tide might be turning. But Richards wasn't going to take this lying down. The very next day, Marcus received a phone call from David, his lawyer. "Marcus," David said, his voice tight with urgency, "we got a problem. Richards is pulling out all the stops now. He's using his connections to launch a full-scale campaign against us. I just got word that he's hired some of the best corporate mercenaries, PR firms, crisis management teams, even political operatives, to attack your character, your credibility. They're digging into your past, and they're going to use everything they can to discredit you." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. He had anticipated some backlash, but this was more than he had bargained for. It wasn't just a battle for truth anymore. It was a war between two vastly unequal forces. Marcus, a man fighting for justice, and Richards, a billionaire with access to the most powerful resources money could buy. David continued, "Look, I know you want to fight back, but we have to be careful. Every move we make right now is being scrutinized. One wrong move, and Richards' team will turn against us." Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. "I didn't ask for this, David. I didn't want this to become a media circus. But if Richards thinks he can scare me into silence, he's wrong." David sighed, the weight of the situation evident in his voice. "I know, but we need to play this carefully. If we go too far, too fast, we could end up losing everything. This isn't just about a lawsuit anymore. It's about protecting your reputation and making sure Richards doesn't destroy in the process." Marcus knew David was right, but the thought of Richards pulling the strings in the background, twisting everything to suit his narrative, made his blood boil. He couldn't let that happen. Not again. "I'm not backing down," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "You do what you need to do, but I'm going to keep pushing forward. I'll make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it takes." Over the next few weeks, Marcus and his team continued to build their case. Every piece of evidence they uncovered seemed to add weight to the growing mountain of proof against Richards' Airline. But the legal battle was far from over. The airline had more resources than Marcus could have ever imagined, and they were using every tool at their disposal to break his resolve. The public's opinion was divided. On social media, there were still many who sided with Richards, claiming that Marcus's accusations were baseless or that he was simply out for revenge. But there were also those who supported Marcus, who recognized the truth in his words and joined the growing movement to hold Richards accountable. Then came the bombshell. It was late one evening when David called Marcus with the news. "Marcus, we got a breakthrough. We found an internal memo that ties Jack Richards directly to the decision to target minority passengers. It's damning. This could be the smoking gun we need to win this case." The memo had been buried deep within the airline's records, hidden among hundreds of other documents. But once David had found it, it was clear. Richards wasn't just running a racist business model. He had personally signed off on policies that explicitly discriminated against minority groups. The evidence was irrefutable. "This changes everything," Marcus said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and triumph. "It's over for him. We've got him." David's voice was steady, but filled with caution. "This is huge, Marcus, but we have to be careful. Richards isn't going to let this go quietly. He'll fight this to the end, and you need to be ready for fallout. But this memo, it's the key. We can finally show the world what he's really been doing." Marcus sat back in his chair, staring at the documents in front of him. The truth was out there now, and with it, the power to bring Jack Richards and his empire to its knees. But Marcus knew that the fight wasn't over. The hardest part was still ahead of him. The war for justice had only just begun. The momentum had shifted. With the internal memo exposing Jack Richards' direct involvement in the discriminatory practices at his airline, Marcus felt an unfamiliar sense of power. The weight of his battle, which had been hanging over him like a storm cloud, now had the potential to bring that storm crashing down on Richards. But Marcus knew that the road ahead was still fraught with danger. Richards would not go down without a fight. This was bigger than a legal case. It was a battle for the soul of an empire. The media frenzy that followed the release of the memo was both exhilarating and terrifying. Headlines screamed of Richards' involvement in a systemic scheme of racial discrimination. CEO of major airline exposed in massive discrimination scandal. Social media exploded with viral hashtags calling for boycotts, and victims of similar mistreatment at the airline came forward with their stories, flooding the internet with testimonials of their own experiences. For Marcus, the growing public support was a vindication of everything he had fought for. He had hoped and prayed that his fight would resonate with others. But as the attention reached a fever pitch, he also felt the impending weight of what he had unleashed. Richards, who had been operating in the shadows for years, was now a target, vulnerable in a way he never had been before. But Marcus was no longer just fighting for his own justice. This was about dismantling the systemic racism that had shaped so much of the world he inhabited. The next few days saw Richards' corporate team scrambling, attempting to control the narrative. They issued half-hearted apologies, but it was clear they were not ready for the full weight of the public's fury. The airline tried to distance itself from Richards, claiming that he was a rogue CEO who had acted independently of the company's values. But the damage had been done. In the midst of this chaos, Jack Richards remained silent. For once, he wasn't issuing statements. He wasn't trying to spin the narrative. Marcus could sense the fear behind Richards' silence, the realization that he had underestimated the power of a single person's voice, Marcus's voice. But it was during a meeting with his legal team that Marcus's sense of victory began to waver. David had just dropped a bombshell. "We're getting pushback, Marcus," David said, his voice grim. "Richards' legal team is pulling every trick in the book. They're trying to discredit the memo. They're calling it fake, claiming it's been doctored. They've already filed a motion to have it thrown out as evidence. The media is starting to question its authenticity. 2. Some of the experts they're hiring are casting doubt on its origins." Marcus's stomach sank. The memo was the linchpin of the entire case. The smoking gun. Without it, everything they had worked for might come crumbling down. "What are we going to do?" Marcus asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "We can't let them get away with this." David sighed. "We need to stay ahead of them. If we can find a whistleblower within the company, someone willing to testify in court, someone who can vouch for the legitimacy of the memo, that could be our turning point. But right now we're running out of time." Marcus felt a deep sense of unease. Richards had already proven he could pull strings behind the scenes, influencing the legal system and the media to protect his empire. It wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight for survival. The legal game had shifted, and Marcus had to adapt. The weeks that followed were a blur of courtroom drama, media confrontations, and legal maneuvering. Marcus's legal team fought relentlessly, but Richards' power seemed to stretch further than anyone could have anticipated. The case moved at a glacial pace, and every step forward felt like it was met with 2 steps back. The legal fees mounted, and the strain on Marcus's personal life intensified. The pressure from Richards' camp was unrelenting. He continued to use his connections to poison the public narrative, calling Marcus a vengeful opportunist, and accusing him of fabricating the whole story to get attention. Meanwhile, the airline attempted to recover by announcing a diversity initiative, as if throwing out a token gesture of inclusivity could erase the systemic racism that had been embedded in the company for years. It all felt like a game to Jack Richards, like he could sweep the truth under the rug and continue business as usual. But Marcus wasn't giving up. The fight had grown personal. He had made it this far, and he would make sure that Richards was held accountable no matter what. Then one fateful evening, as Marcus sat at his desk in the office, a message came through from Brianna. "I think I found something," she wrote. "You're going to want to see this." Brianna had managed to track down one of the airline's former executives, someone who had worked directly under Jack Richards. The executive had left the company under suspicious circumstances, but had kept quiet until now. Brianna had managed to arrange a meeting. The The next morning, Marcus sat in a small, nondescript cafe, his heart racing with anticipation. The meeting was supposed to be discreet. If anyone connected the former executive to the lawsuit, it could be a disaster. But the man had agreed to talk, and Marcus wasn't about to pass up this chance. The executive, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a tense demeanor, sat down across from Marcus. He looked over his shoulder nervously, as if afraid someone might be watching. "What's this all about?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low. The man shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "You've got the memo, right? The one that's been going around?" Marcus nodded. "We have it. But Richards' team has tried to get it thrown out. They're claiming it's fake." The man sighed, a haunted look crossing his face. "It's not fake. I know it's real. I was there. I saw it. Richard signed off on everything directly. I was one of the people who helped implement some of those policies. But I couldn't stomach it anymore. I left because I couldn't be a part of what he was doing. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make it stop." Marcus leaned forward, urgency in his voice. "What do you mean? What exactly did Richard sign off on? We need everything you know." The executive hesitated, looking around once more. "Richards doesn't just discriminate in hiring or promotions. It's the entire structure of the company. There's a reason why people of color never make it to the higher ranks. He intentionally kept them out, even if they were the most qualified. He only wanted certain types of people running the airline. It wasn't just about race. It was about control. He wanted to make sure the people around him were loyal, even if that loyalty came at the expense of talent and diversity." Marcus sat back, his mind racing. This was the testimony they needed. If the executive was willing to go on the record and testify in court, they would have the final piece of the puzzle. "I'll help," the executive said quietly, his voice shaky. "I'll testify. I can't go public with my name. Richards will destroy me. He's already tried." Marcus nodded, understanding the risk the man was taking. "I'll protect you. This is bigger than us. This is for everyone who's been treated unfairly by Richards and his company." As they shook hands and parted ways, Marcus felt a surge of hope. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Richards' empire was starting to crumble. The walls he had built around his empire were beginning to crack, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. Days later, Marcus's legal team filed a new motion, this time including the testimony from a former executive. The case had taken a sharp turn. With the new evidence, it seemed that the court would have no choice but to allow the case to proceed. But Marcus knew that Richards wasn't going to back down. This fight wasn't over yet. Richards would try to use his power, his influence, and every resource at his disposal to crush Marcus. But Marcus was done being afraid. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. The reckoning had only just begun. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the days stretched into weeks. Every witness brought forward, every piece of evidence uncovered, every legal argument made. It all seemed to intensify the battle between Marcus Davis and Jack Richards. What had once been a fight for personal justice had now evolved into something larger, a reckoning, a public dismantling of an empire built on systemic injustice. The media coverage remained relentless. Journalists packed the courtroom, cameras clicking away, eager to capture every moment of this high-stakes legal drama. The headlines were no longer just about the lawsuit. They were about the cultural reckoning taking place before the public's eyes. The airline's brand, once synonymous with luxury and prestige, was now being associated with words like discrimination, abuse of power, and corruption. Inside the courtroom, Marcus felt a strange sense of clarity. The man who had walked into that airport gate a few months ago, humiliated and powerless, was no longer the same. He had shed his fear, his doubts, and now stood resolutely in the midst of this fight, determined to see it through to the end. And yet, despite the weight of the case and the growing pressure from Richards' legal team, Marcus could sense a change in the air. Richards, who had once exuded control, was no longer the same confident man. The cracks were beginning to show. During one of the key moments of the trial, Marcus's lawyer, David, called a former executive to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as the man nervously took the oath, his hands trembling slightly as he faced the jury. He had agreed to testify under the condition that his identity remained protected, his face obscured, his voice altered. Even though the truth had now come to light, the fear of retaliation from Richards remained. But Marcus knew that this was a turning point. With this testimony, there was no turning back. The former executive's voice, distorted by technology, filled the room. I worked closely with Jack Richards for over 10 years. He was very clear about the kind of people he wanted in positions of power within the company. People who were loyal to him, people who looked like him. The voice paused, shaking with the weight of confession. We were told, outright, not to hire black candidates for senior positions. We were given orders to limit their advancement, even if they had the experience and qualifications. The company's diversity initiatives were just window dressing, things we could point to when questioned, but never really meant to change the way things operated. The courtroom was deathly still. The jury leaned forward, clearly impacted by the gravity of the testimony. Marcus could feel the weight of it, too, the walls closing in on Richards, whose team had spent weeks attempting to discredit everything. But this moment was irrefutable. The former executive continued. Richards didn't just condone it, he instructed it. And when people like Marcus spoke up, they were quietly pushed out or sidelined. He was aware of every decision we made. I've seen the emails. I've seen the directives. And I cannot stay silent any longer. The room held its breath. For the first time, the depth of Jack Richards' complicity in the discrimination became undeniable. The jury, the public, and everyone involved knew now that this wasn't just about a few bad apples in a corrupt system. This was about Jack Richards himself, the man who had built an empire on the backs of those he had systematically oppressed. Marcus sat silently, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the world would finally understand what had been happening behind closed doors. It felt like a victory, but it also felt hollow. The cost of getting here had been high, far higher than he'd ever expected. Richards' legal team, now scrambling, tried to discredit the testimony. They argued that the former executive was biased, that his motives for coming forward were questionable. But the evidence was too strong. There was nothing they could do to deny the truth anymore. When Marcus took the stand a few days later, his resolve was stronger than ever. He spoke calmly but with fire in his voice, recounting his experiences not just at the airline but throughout his life. How he had risen from a childhood shaped by discrimination, how he had fought to prove his worth in a world that refused to acknowledge it. He spoke about the incident at the airport, the humiliation he had faced, and how it had ignited the fire within him to seek justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under the same system. He didn't just want to win the case. He wanted to change the system that had allowed it to exist in the first place. It wasn't long after that the tide began to turn in favor of Marcus and his team. With the combination of the damning testimony, the internal memo, and Marcus's powerful testimony, it became clear to the jury that Richards had been the architect of the toxic corporate culture at the airline. The jury deliberated for days, but when they finally returned with their verdict, the decision was clear. Jack Richards and his airline were found guilty of systemic racial discrimination. The jury awarded Marcus damages, but more importantly, they recommended that the company undergo sweeping reforms, including a complete overhaul of its hiring practices and a public commitment to diversity and inclusion. But the most significant blow came in the form of an injunction placed on the company. The court ordered that Jack Richards be removed from his position as CEO, citing his direct involvement in the discriminatory practices. The court ruled that he would no longer be allowed to have any role in the airline's management, and that a third-party oversight committee would be established to ensure the airline's practices adhered to the new standards of quality and fairness. The moment the verdict was read aloud, a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus didn't react immediately. He simply stood, his eyes fixed on the jury as they filed out. The fight was over, and he had won. But as the weight of the decision sank in, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of quiet triumph. Jack Richards, the man who had built his fortune on the exploitation of others, had been brought to his knees. And in the process, Marcus had dismantled a system of abuse that had affected countless people, both inside and outside of the airline. The aftermath of the trial was nothing short of transformative. The airline, now under new leadership, began its process of reformation. The board of directors appointed a new CEO, someone with a track record of promoting diversity and inclusion, and began implementing the changes that had been demanded in court. Marcus, however, wasn't interested in running the company. He had bigger plans that would continue to fight for racial justice on a broader scale. In the months that followed, Marcus became a national figure, not just because of his victory in court, but because of the broader movement he had sparked. His story became a symbol of resistance against systemic oppression, and he used his newfound platform to push for real, meaningful change in other industries. He continued to speak out about racial inequality, challenging businesses, corporations, and government institutions to confront their biases and work toward justice. He established a foundation to support and mentor young Black entrepreneurs, ensuring that the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles he had. And while the scars of his past would never fully fade, Marcus felt a sense of peace, knowing that, through his resilience and determination, he had helped to create a better future for others. He had fought not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had been oppressed. Jack Richards, on the other hand, disappeared from the public eye. His name became a cautionary tale, a symbol of corporate greed, racism, and the corrupting power of unchecked privilege. His empire, once towering and unshakable, lay in ruins. For Marcus, this victory was bittersweet. It wasn't just about the downfall of one man. It was about the people who had been wronged, who had been kept down for far too long. And though the battle had been won, he knew that the fight for justice was ongoing. There was more work to be done, more systems to be broken down, and more voices to be heard. And Marcus was ready for whatever came next. The war was far from over, but he had just delivered the first blow. The press coverage of Marcus's victory was relentless. It dominated the news for days. Stories of how a single man had brought down one of the most powerful CEOs in the airline industry, how his fight for justice had rippled across the nation. Jack Richards' fall from grace was swift and unforgiving, and the once iconic airline was now embroiled in a whirlwind of public backlash and corporate restructuring. But despite the headlines and recognition, Marcus found himself facing a new kind of challenge: how to live in a world where he was no longer just a businessman, but a symbol. The weight of his newfound fame was both a gift and a burden. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt like his every move was being watched. He had become a hero to some, a villain to others. Social media was flooded with praise, but also with vitriol. His success in bringing down Jack Richards had made him a target for those who didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, the true depth of his fight. But Marcus was used to adversity. He had never been one to shy away from challenges, and this was no different. In the weeks following the trial, Marcus spent his days meeting with advocacy groups, consulting with business leaders, and speaking at conferences. He continued to use his platform to push for systemic change, demanding that businesses adopt fairer practices and take responsibility for their actions. His foundation grew rapidly, providing resources, mentorship, and funding for young Black entrepreneurs, those who had been held back by the same barriers he had faced. But for all the external victories, Marcus found himself wrestling with something deeper, something that had been buried beneath the surface throughout his entire journey: the emotional cost of what he'd been through. Late one evening, after an exhausting day of meetings, Marcus sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the city below. The bright lights of downtown shimmered, but his mind was far from the bustle of the world outside. His phone buzzed on his desk, a reminder that his work was never truly done. But he didn't reach for it. Instead, he let the silence fill the room, allowing himself a rare moment of reflection. The truth was, he was tired of fighting, tired of constantly having to prove himself in a world that had never given him the benefit of a doubt. His victory over Jack Richards had come at a cost he hadn't fully understood until now. His personal life had been turned upside down. His relationships had suffered. And despite the progress he had made, the pain of his past, the racism, the injustice, the betrayal, still haunted him. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He had won. The fight had been worth it. But now, as he looked ahead, he realized that this victory was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. There were still countless people out there who had been hurt by systems like the one Jack Richards had built. The battle for equality, for dignity, was far from over. The door to his office creaked open, breaking his thoughts. Brianna stepped inside, holding a stack of papers in one hand, her expression serious but warm. "You look like you could use a break," she said gently, setting the papers down on his desk. "You've been pushing yourself pretty hard." Marcus looked up at her, offering a tired smile. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Bree. I thought this would feel different. I thought I'd be happy once I brought Richards down. But it's just not that simple." Brianna pulled up a chair and sat down beside him, her eyes kind but firm. "You've done more than anyone could have expected. You took on a system that was built to keep people like you and me down, and you've cracked it wide open. That's a big deal, Marcus." "I know," he said quietly, his voice betraying the exhaustion he felt. "But it still feels like I'm fighting. And it's not just a fight with Richards. It's everything. The years of feeling like I wasn't enough, like I had to prove myself over and over again. The people who told me I'd never make it, the people who doubted me, who pushed me down. I don't know how to let that go." Brianna studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I get it. It's not just about winning the case or changing things on the outside. It's about what this has cost you personally, emotionally. And it's okay to feel the weight of that. You can't pour from an empty cup, Marcus." He let out a slow breath, try to absorb her words. "I keep thinking that when this is all over, when we've made the changes we need to make, when I've done enough, then I can finally rest. But I'm not sure I know what that looks like anymore." Brianna reached over, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to figure out all at once. You've been carrying the weight of this fight for a long time, and it's okay to take a step back and breathe. The world is going to keep pushing you. But you've already done more than most people could ever imagine, and you don't have to keep fighting every battle alone." Marcus looked out the window again, the weight of her words settling in. He had been so focused on the fight, on proving everyone wrong, that he hadn't allowed himself the space to heal. He had pushed himself to the edge, convincing himself that once the fight was over, he could finally find peace. But peace wasn't something that came from external victories. It came from within. Brianna's voice broke through his thoughts again. "There's a world of people out there who need your voice, Marcus. And there's a world of people who will support you, who will carry you when it gets heavy. You don't have to keep going this alone." He nodded slowly, his heart lightening just a fraction. "You're right. I've been so focused on the fight. I forgot what it feels like to rest. But maybe it's time to think about the next step, not just for the cause, but for me. I need to remember that it's okay to live after the fight." Brianna smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Exactly. You've got this. And when you're ready, we'll keep pushing forward. But for now, take a moment to breathe." Marcus sat back in his chair, the weight in his chest easing ever so slightly. The world was still a mess. There was still so much to fix. But in that moment, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace, a moment to acknowledge the long, difficult journey he had been on and to realize that he had already done more than he'd ever imagined possible. His fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to fight and live in equal measure. A few weeks later, Marcus found himself on a flight, heading to a new city for a speaking engagement. As the plane soared above the clouds, he gazed out the window, feeling a calm that had eluded him for so long. It wasn't just the cause or the victory that mattered now. It was the understanding that the journey itself, this life he had built, was worth living, and that even in the midst of the fight, he deserved to experience moments of joy, rest, and peace. As the plane glided smoothly toward its destination, Marcus allowed himself to close his eyes and rest. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face again, this time, not as a man running from his past, but as one who had finally begun to embrace his future.